In 1920, the United States Census Bureau had to count Akron, Ohio, 3 times because nobody in Washington believed the numbers. The city had gone from 69,067 people to 208,435 in a single decade, a 200% increase that made it statistically the fastest growing city in America. Not New York, not Los Angeles, not Chicago. Akron, a landlocked city in northeast Ohio, 40 miles south of Cleveland, sitting at the highest point of a canal that wouldn't even exist in another decade. And if you had tried to explain to anyone in 1825, when the whole place was 80 acres of surveyed mud, that this particular hilltop would one day build most of the tires on Earth, they would have assumed you were drunk, which, incidentally, is another thing Akron would eventually become famous for addressing. The name itself tells you what drew the first speculators. Akron comes from the Greek word for summit, for high place, and the man who chose it was General Simon Perkins, an Ohio Canal Commissioner who understood that the most valuable real estate on any waterway is wherever the water has to change levels. The Ohio and Erie Canal, authorized in 1825, was meant to connect Lake Erie at Cleveland to the Ohio River at Portsmouth, 309 miles of hand-dug channel cutting through the center of the state. Akron sat at the highest point on the entire route. That meant locks, lots of them. 15 locks climbing up from the Little Cuyahoga Valley to the summit. Every boat going through had to stop, had to wait, and the men on those boats had to eat, drink, sleep, and spend. Perkins and a settler named Paul Williams laid out the town in December of 1825, and by the time the first canal boat left Akron for Cleveland on July 3rd, 1827, arriving to great fanfare on the 4th, there was already enough of a village that people started calling the surrounding area Summit County. The canal changed everything about the economics of the interior. Before it opened, a farmer couldn't profitably ship grain more than about 30 miles overland. After it opened, Akron became a milling center almost overnight. Wheat came in by wagon, got ground into flour by water-powered mills along something called the Cascade Race, a mill race built in 1832 by a man named Eliakim Crosby that ran parallel to the canal and harnessed the Little Cuyahoga River, and the flour floated north to Cleveland or south to Cincinnati. Within a few years, that mill race was powering flour mills, a woolen mill, a furniture factory, 5 iron furnaces, and a distillery. The Irish immigrants who had dug the canal by hand settled into a neighborhood near the locks that people called Little Dublin. They formed the city's first Catholic parish, St. Vincent de Paul. The stone church still stands. But here is the thing about canal towns. The canal is the whole economy, and canals are fragile. Akron was chartered as a village in 1836, became the county seat in 1842, and was chartered as a city in 1865. By which time the railroads were already making the canal less relevant. Yet even as the canal aged, the city managed to attract people and causes that had nothing to do with waterborne commerce. In 1844, the abolitionist John Brown moved into a house across the street from Colonel Simon Perkins, son of the city's founder, and the two became business partners in wool trading. Brown's house still stands, and in 1851, when the Ohio Women's Rights Convention met in Akron at the Universalist Old Stone Church, Sojourner Truth rose and delivered what became one of the most famous speeches in American history. Akron also reshaped American education. The Akron School Law of 1847 created the K-12 grade structure that every state eventually adopted. For a small canal town, it punched well above its weight. But the canal's commercial days were numbered. By the 1870s, the waterway was leaking and losing traffic to the iron rails. And then, on Easter Sunday, March 23, 1913, nearly 10 inches of rain fell on Akron after a winter of heavy snowfall. The resulting flood killed 5 people and destroyed the Ohio and Erie Canal outright. Canal transportation in Akron ended that day, permanently. The thing that had built the city was simply erased. The logical next chapter for Akron would have been a slow fade into pleasant obscurity, a small county seat with pretty hills and some old lock walls. That's what happened to dozens of canal towns across Ohio. But Akron had already reinvented itself once before the canal died, and the man responsible was Ferdinand Schumacher. Schumacher arrived in Akron from Hanover, Germany in 1851 and opened a small grocery store near the canal. He stocked oats because oatmeal was a common breakfast in Germany. Nobody in Akron bought them. Americans fed oats to horses. For 3 years, Schumacher worried about this. Then, in 1854, he built a hand-operated mill in the back of his store and started grinding oats into something he could sell as human food: steel-cut oatmeal. It worked. The Civil War made it work faster. The U.S. government ordered hundreds of barrels to feed Union troops because oatmeal was cheap, easy to prepare, and didn't spoil. After the war, Schumacher expanded relentlessly. He imported porcelain rollers from England in 1878 to manufacture rolled oats, a softer and quicker cooking product. By the 1870s and 1880s, his German Mills American Cereal Company was the largest oatmeal producer in the country, and his massive jumbo plant in Akron was selling 360,000 pounds of oatmeal a day. He ran the first known cereal advertisement in the Akron Beacon Journal in 1870. People called him the Oatmeal King. Through a series of mergers and consolidations, some of which Schumacher fought bitterly because he didn't believe in advertising or fancy packaging. "I built the biggest business in the whole country without advertising," he reportedly complained. The company eventually became the Quaker Oats Company, whose trademark, registered in 1877, was the first ever trademark for a breakfast cereal in the United States. For a number of years before the turn of the century, Quaker Oats was the biggest industry and the largest single employer in the city. Before rubber, before tires, before blimps, Akron ran on oatmeal. The Quaker Oats factory buildings, the brick silos, the sturdy warehouses, still stand on their original stone foundations, rebuilt after a fire in 1886. They were later converted into a hotel, shops, and eventually student housing for the University of Akron. The cylindrical silos became hotel rooms. If you think that's a strange thing to do with a grain silo, you're right, but it tells you something about Akron. The buildings outlast the industries, and somebody always finds a new use. Now, the man who actually turned Akron into something unlike any other city in America was not from Akron at all. But before he arrived, the city had already developed a surprising range of industries on the back of its railroad connections. Summit County had become the sewer pipe capital of America, thanks to rich clay deposits in East Akron. The Barber Match Company at one point produced a fifth of all the matches in the country. There were stoneware factories, fishing tackle workshops, and farm machinery plants. Akron was busy, diversified, and modestly prosperous. But none of it was the kind of industry that could build a great city. Benjamin Franklin Goodrich was a physician from upstate New York who had served as a Union Army surgeon, tried his hand at oil speculation and real estate, and in 1869 bought a failing rubber company called the Hudson River Rubber Company in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. When that venture also failed, Goodrich started looking for a better location. The Akron Board of Trade, the city's boosters, offered him $13,600 to relocate. In today's money, roughly $250,000. It was a bet by a small city on an unproven industry. Goodrich took it, moved to Akron in 1870, and founded what became the B.F. Goodrich Company, the first rubber manufacturer west of the Allegheny Mountains. His first product was a cotton-covered rubber fire hose, inspired, the story goes, by watching a friend's house burn because the leather hoses had frozen and cracked. He was the first person in Akron to own a telephone, a gift from Alexander Graham Bell in 1877, connecting his house on Quaker Street to his factory on Rubber Street. Goodrich himself died young, at 46, in 1888, chasing a cure for lung disease in Colorado. He never saw a single automobile tire come off his factory floor, but his company had planted the seed. Akron had water from the old canal system, cheap coal from nearby mines, a ready labor force, and good railroad connections. When the automobile arrived in the late 1890s, the city was positioned, almost by accident, to become the center of the tire industry. Frank Seiberling, a 38-year-old with no rubber experience, borrowed $3,500 from his brother-in-law, Lucius Miles, in 1898 and used it as a down payment on an abandoned factory. He named his company Goodyear after Charles Goodyear, the inventor of vulcanized rubber, though the two men had no connection whatsoever. The winged foot trademark came from a statuette of Mercury sitting on a newel post in Seiberling's own home. Within a decade, Goodyear's chief engineer, Paul Litchfield, developed the straight-side tire, replacing the inferior clincher design that was nearly impossible to change on the road, and followed it with the all-weather tread in 1908, a diamond-patterned grip that became the company's signature. 2 years after Seiberling founded Goodyear in 1900, Harvey Firestone moved to Akron at the age of 31 with his wife and infant son and started the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. By 1905, Firestone had an exclusive contract to supply tires for 2,000 Ford automobiles, a deal forged through the personal friendship between Harvey Firestone and Henry Ford that would last their entire lives. In 1915, William O'Neill started General Tire. Together, these four firms, Goodrich, Goodyear, Firestone, and General, became known as the Big Four, and all of them were headquartered within a few miles of one another in this city that, a generation earlier, had been grinding oats. Prior to the Second World War, these Akron companies produced roughly 80% of all the tires made in America. Think about the economics of that decade between 1910 and 1920. Global rubber consumption surged from around 45,000 tons a year to nearly 340,000, driven entirely by the automobile. Akron's factories couldn't build tires fast enough. They couldn't build additions fast enough. They couldn't hire men fast enough. The rubber companies sent recruiters deep into West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, looking for strong men willing to work. People from Appalachia flooded north in such numbers that West Virginians later joked that the 3 R's were reading, writing, and the road up Route 21 to Akron. African Americans from the Deep South came too. The city's black population rose from 525 to 5,580 in that single decade. Immigrants arrived from Italy, Hungary, Serbia, and a dozen other countries. The population tripled. Housing couldn't keep up. Men slept in shifts in rented beds. One man sleeping while his housemate worked the factory floor, then switching. The rubber barons responded in a way that was unusual for American industrialists. They built neighborhoods. Frank Seiberling, who had by this point become wealthy beyond anything his borrowed $3,500 could have predicted, personally bought a large parcel of farmland northeast of the Goodyear factory and hired his estate landscape architect to lay out Goodyear Heights, sweeping streets instead of a grid, gas, electricity, telephones, provisions for future streetcar lines. Harvey Firestone, not to be outdone, hired his own landscape architect, Alling DeForest, to design Firestone Park, with tree-lined boulevards curving around a central green shaped like the Firestone Shield, churches and schools within walking distance, and deliberately mixed housing styles so that families of different income levels would live side by side. Those neighborhoods are still there. The houses are still solid. You can walk Firestone Park today and feel the intention in the layout, the way the streets curve, the way the park anchors everything. There was one key difference between them, though. Goodyear Heights had an explicit policy against selling homes to African Americans. Firestone Park did too, initially. The people who built and drove the tires, if they were black, lived elsewhere, closer to the factories, closer to the chemicals. Meanwhile, the executives lived magnificently. The west side of Akron, along Portage Path and in the area known as Merriman Heights, became what people called Rubber Baron Heights. All the great captains of the rubber industry built their homes there. The Seiberlings, the Firestones, Paul Litchfield of Goodyear, and John S. Knight, whose newspaper, the Akron Beacon Journal, would become one of the most respected papers in the Midwest. Senator Charles Dick lived there. Even Wendell Willkie, the 1940 Republican presidential candidate, made his home in Merriman Heights for a time. And while his workers moved into bungalows, Seiberling himself was building something else entirely. In 1907, he began buying farmland and cornfields on the west side of Akron, along Portage Path, the old Indian trail that traced the highest ridge, where the elevation hit 1,100 feet. He hired architect Charles Schneider, and together with his wife Gertrude, they traveled to England to tour manor houses, Compton Winyates, Ockwell's Manor, Haddon Hall. The result was Stan Highwit Hall, a 64,500 square foot Tudor revival mansion built between 1912 and 1915, requiring 3,000 separate blueprints and a temporary railroad spur just to deliver the building materials. The architect's fee alone was $150,000. The house had an indoor swimming pool, a billiard room, a music room with an Aeolian organ, a formal dining room that seated 40, and 5 guest suites. The name came from Old English, Stan Highwit, meaning stone quarry, for the abandoned quarry on the grounds. Above the front door, carved in stone, the family motto, Non Nobis Solum, not for us alone. That motto wasn't entirely a platitude. The Seiberlings opened the estate to the community repeatedly. Will Rogers performed there. Shirley Temple visited. And on Mother's Day, 1935, in the estate's Gate Lodge, Henrietta Seiberling, Frank's daughter-in-law, introduced 2 men struggling with alcohol, a New York stockbroker named Bill Wilson and a local surgeon named Robert Smith. They talked well into the evening. That conversation led to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. The organization was formally established on June 10, 1935, in Akron. Dr. Bob's house at 855 Ardmore Avenue is still open to visitors. By the late 1920s, Akron was building itself at a pace and scale that reflected how much money was coursing through the city. In 1927, the O'Neill family demolished the old Merrill Pottery Works at the corner of South Main and State Streets and erected an 800,000 square foot department store designed by the Chicago firm Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White, the same architects who built Cleveland's Terminal Tower. May department stores had acquired O'Neill's for $1 million back in 1912, and the new flagship was their cathedral of retail. Directly across South Main Street in 1930, Bert and Harry Polsky, sons of Polish immigrant Abraham Polsky, opened their own department store, a 6-story Art Deco building designed by the New York firm Starrett and Van Vleck, spanning a full city block, with a price tag of $2.1 million. Polsky's had 4 levels of merchandise, from fine jewelry to furniture, and a restaurant called the Puritan that was famous for its pies. At Christmas time, both stores lit up their display windows with elaborate animated scenes. Elves, nutcrackers, trains, and families drove in from all over Northeast Ohio to walk between them. In 1929, the Akron Civic Theater opened on South Main Street, and its origin story contains a small parable about ambition and timing. A local dance hall owner named L. Oscar Beck had originally commissioned the project as the Hippodrome, a 3,000-seat theater with 30 stores and restaurants lining its arcade. He began construction on the lobby in 1919, riding the crest of the rubber boom. By 1921, the project was bankrupt. The lobby stood alone for years, its theater end boarded up, a monument to overreach. Then, Marcus Lowe, the entertainment mogul who founded the Lowe's theater chain, took over the project and hired the celebrated theater architect John Eberson to complete it. Eberson designed it as an atmospheric theater, one of only 5 of his atmospheric theaters still standing in the country, built to make the audience feel they were sitting in a Moorish garden under an open sky. The lobby, which Beck had already built, became a 4-story Moorish castle filled with medieval carvings, authentic European antiques, and Italian alabaster sculptures. The auditorium's ceiling was painted to resemble a night sky, with twinkling electric stars and machines that drifted clouds slowly across the dome. A full-sized Wurlitzer organ rose from beneath the stage on a hydraulic lift. The theater seated roughly 3,000. Here's a detail that captures Akron's layered history. The lobby of the Civic actually extends over the old bed of the Ohio and Erie Canal. The building literally spans the canal that built the city. Also, in 1929, the Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation erected the air dock on the east side of Akron, a structure so enormous it defied comprehension. Designed by Carl Arnstein of the Wilbur Watson Engineering Company, it was 1,175 feet long, 325 feet wide, and 211 feet tall, roughly as tall as a 22-story building, covering an area larger than 8 football fields placed side by side. It had 364,000 square feet of unobstructed floor space, 55 million cubic feet of interior volume, and was the largest building in the world without interior supports. 11 steel parabolic arches held the thing up. The semicircular doors at each end weighed 600 tons apiece and rolled on railroad tracks powered by 40 wheels. Construction took barely 7 months, from April 20th to November 25th, 1929, and cost $2.2 million, which is roughly $26 million adjusted. The building was so vast that its internal temperature could differ dramatically from outside conditions, and there are persistent stories, dating to 1930, that it actually rains inside the air dock when conditions are right. The Navy's USS Akron, the world's first purpose-built flying aircraft carrier, was built there in 1931. It was 785 feet long and could carry 5 Sparrowhawk fighter planes internally, launching and recovering them in mid-air through a trapeze system in its belly. Its sister ship, the USS Macon, followed in 1933. Both crashed within 2 years of launch, the Akron in a storm off New Jersey in 1933, killing 73 of 76 crew members, and the Macon off Point Sur, California, in 1935. The age of the rigid airship was over almost as soon as it began, but the building designed to berth them endured. The same year as the air dock, the city crowned its skyline. The First National Bank building, later known by various names as Ownership Changed, and now called Huntington Tower, was completed in 1931 at the corner of South Main and East Mill Streets. Designed by Walker and Weeks in the Art Deco style, it rose 27 stories and 331 feet to the roof, making it the tallest building between New York and Chicago on its particular latitude. From its upper floors, you could see the air dock to the east and the hills rolling west toward Stan Highwit. The Mayflower Hotel opened the same year, designed by the same Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White who had done O'Neill's. It became Akron's finest hotel, hosting most of the city's important social events for the next 3 decades. And the YMCA building, 16 stories, Art Deco, occupying a full city block, opened on March 10, 1931, just north of O'Neill's. All of this construction happened between about 1927 and 1931. Almost everything that defined downtown Akron's physical character was built in a 4-year window, right at the hinge between the rubber boom and the Depression. If you visited Akron in, say, 1940, you would have seen a city of 244,000 that looked, frankly, like it had been built for a city of 400,000. The architecture was too grand, the buildings too ambitious, the department stores too vast. It was a city that had been caught mid-leap. The Depression hit Akron hard. The rubber companies cut hours and wages. Goodyear in 1930 had already shifted from 3 8-hour shifts to 4 6-hour shifts to spread the work around, a humane move that nevertheless meant less pay for each worker. Then, in late 1935, Goodyear announced it was going back to 8-hour shifts and laying off the redundant 4th shift workers. On February 14, 1936, tire builders in Goodyear's Plant 2 sat down at their machines and refused to work. They didn't walk out. They sat in. By February 17th, 4,000 workers had voted to strike, and the enormous 11-mile Goodyear facility shut down completely. About 10,000 workers from various trades picketed. Goodyear tried to break the strike, first with police, who refused to confront the workers with violence, and then with a 5,000-member company-funded Law and Order League, which the Summit County Central Labor Council talked down from confrontation. After a month, Goodyear capitulated and recognized the United Rubber Workers Union. The sit-down technique, which had been pioneered at General Tire in Akron in 1934, spread from here to the auto plants in Flint, Michigan, and into the broader history of American labor. The war brought Akron back. Rubber was essential for military vehicles, aircraft, and naval operations, and the air dock switched to building blimps for Navy patrol and convoy protection, those lighter-than-air ships that could hover over Atlantic waters for hours, spotting enemy submarines. Goodyear alone built more than 100 blimps during the war. Every factory in Akron ran at full capacity, and the city felt useful again, essential again. But here is where the story begins to hinge. During the war, Japanese conquests in Southeast Asia cut off 90% of America's natural rubber supply. Akron's chemists at Goodrich, Goodyear, and Firestone developed synthetic rubber processes that, by the war's end, had surpassed pre-war natural rubber production. It was an extraordinary achievement, and it should have been the foundation for Akron's next century. In a sense, It was. But the city that thrived from the innovation wouldn't be Akron itself. After the war, the factories kept humming, though never quite at wartime intensity. The 1950s were prosperous, suburban. Akron annexed the adjacent town of Kenmore by voter approval in 1929, expanding its tax base. The All-American Soapbox Derby, which had started in the 1930s as the brainchild of an Akron journalist named Myron Scott, became an annual summer institution, drawing boys from across the country to race gravity-powered cars down Derby Downs. The Professional Bowlers Association was founded in Akron in 1958. The Firestone Country Club hosted PGA tournaments. If you were a rubber worker in the 1950s, you could make a genuinely good living. A man named Perkins Pringle, who had come up from Mississippi in 1946 and worked his way through every department at Goodyear, the mill room mixing raw rubber with carbon black, the tube room, the rubber shop, the tire tread shop, was earning $100,000 a year by the time he retired in 1979. That was real money, middle class and then some money, built on physical labor in a factory that smelled of sulfur and carbon. The population peaked in 1960 at 290,351. That was the summit, the high place, and nobody knew it at the time. The downtown was still busy. O'Neill's and Polsky's still lit their Christmas windows. The Mayflower, by then a Sheraton, was still Akron's hotel, hosting civic events and visiting dignitaries. You could still stand on South Main Street at lunch hour and have to dodge people on the sidewalk. The streetscape ran from the North Hill Viaduct all the way to Exchange, lined with retail stores, restaurants, banks, and offices. A boy dragged downtown by his mother, the kind of mother who did not drive a car and took the bus instead, would walk those blocks between the department stores and feel like he was in a real city, because he was. The lunch counters were full. The theater marquee glowed. The organ at the Civic still rose from the floor, but the numbers were already shifting. By 1960, Akron's rubber factories produced about 40% of the nation's tires, but the factories themselves were aging. Multi-story brick buildings designed for bias-ply tire production, with equipment that was decades old. The newer plants that companies were building were single-story, spread-out facilities optimized for efficiency, and they were going up in Alabama, Tennessee, the Carolinas, places with cheaper land, lower wages, and less union presence. The workers were still in Akron, but the future of the work was quietly moving south. Then came the radial tire. The French company Michelin had been making them since the 1940s, and by the late 1960s, Consumer Reports was telling American drivers that radials lasted longer, steered better, and delivered superior gas mileage. There was just one problem from Akron's perspective. You couldn't convert an old bias-ply factory to radial production without enormous capital expenditure. It was cheaper to build new, and the radial tire lasted so much longer than the old bias-ply that consumers didn't need to replace tires as often, which meant the total market shrank even as the technology improved. Goodyear, the largest of the Big Four, spent heavily in 1974 to retool for radials. It survived, though it later had to sell off its most profitable divisions and take on massive debt to fend off a hostile British takeover attempt in 1986. Firestone's story was worse. A cautionary tale in cost-cutting. Rather than investing in new radial equipment, Firestone tried to convert its old bias-ply machines, which produced a defective tire with tread separation problems. The resulting recall was the largest in tire industry history. By the late 1970s, Firestone was more than $1 billion in debt and losing $250 million a year. The company brought in John Nevin, the former head of Zenith Electronics, who closed 9 of 17 manufacturing plants, 6 in a single day, and moved the company's headquarters from Akron to Chicago. In 1988, Japan's Bridgestone bought Firestone for far less than the company had been worth a decade and a half earlier. The headquarters eventually moved to Nashville. General Tire sold its plants to Continental, a German company, in 1987, and Continental moved its American headquarters to Charlotte. B.F. Goodrich, the company that had started it all, the company that existed because the Akron Board of Trade once scraped together $13,600, merged its tire operations with Uniroyal in 1986, and then sold out entirely. Michelin acquired the tire business in 1990. By 1981, Goodrich, Goodyear, and Firestone had all stopped manufacturing tires in Akron. General Tire, the last holdout, closed its remaining Akron factory shortly after. Between 1980 and 1990, employment in plastics and rubber manufacturing in Akron dropped from 26,000 to 16,000. The population fell from 275,000 in 1970 to 237,000 in 1980 to 223,000 in 1990. Each decade brought its own particular losses. Polsky's department store closed in 1978. The University of Akron eventually took over the building. Students now have classes in what was once 4 floors of merchandise, and they say the building feels dark and dreary with hardly any windows. The Mayflower Hotel ceased operations and sat empty for years. O'Neill's was absorbed through a series of mergers. May Company, Ohio, then Kaufman's, and the 800,000 square foot building was greatly downsized. The old B.F. Goodrich downtown complex, a 27-building compound containing the original factory, was mostly shuttered in 1987 when Goodrich closed its manufacturing operations. A group of New York developers bought the vacant portion and renamed it Canal Place. The Akron Beacon-Journal, once a Knight Ridder flagship and a Pulitzer Prize winner, changed hands repeatedly. Akron Union Station, which from 1891 to 1971 had offered passenger rail service to the Midwest and to Washington and New York, lost its last legacy train, the Baltimore and Ohio's Shenandoah, in 1971. Amtrak's Three Rivers route came through for a while, but that was discontinued in 2005. Today, the nearest Amtrak station is in Alliance, Ohio, or Cleveland. The Innerbelt Freeway, designed in the 1960s to connect directly to State Route 8, was never finished. The plans were shelved in the mid-1970s because of financial troubles. It comes to an abrupt end near the northern boundary of downtown, where it becomes a boulevard named for Martin Luther King, Jr. The Civic Theater nearly became a parking lot. In 1965, with the building deteriorating and no one willing to invest, the Akron Jaycees launched a fundraiser and bought it for $60,000. A group of women formed a guild to keep it running. Ruth Onslager, the widow of a B.F. Goodrich chemist, donated $22,000. The women wrote to celebrities and persuaded Helen Hayes to perform, which brought in $6,500, enough to cover the mortgage. In 1975, they installed a concession stand behind the grand lobby, and the revenue from popcorn and candy kept the theater alive. A full renovation came in 2001, costing $19 million, much of it from the county and city. The theater is still there, on South Main, with its twinkling stars and drifting clouds. Stan Hiawatt survived too, though just barely. F.A. Seiberling had lost control of Goodyear in the 1920s in a corporate shakeup. He and his brother started a new company, the Seiberling Rubber Company, which struggled through the Depression and was eventually bought by Firestone in 1968. When F.A. died in 1955, the estate was in disrepair. His 6 surviving children tried to donate it to various institutions, but no one would take a 64,500 square foot mansion without an endowment. A group of West Akron women, friends and neighbors of the family, formed a nonprofit to save it. Today it's a National Historic Landmark, open to the public, its gardens restored, 95% of the original furnishings still in place. The air dock still stands on the east side of town along U.S. Route 224. It is not open to the public. You can see it from the highway, this colossal arched form rising above the flat commercial landscape like something from a different era's idea of the future, which is exactly what it is. Akron today has about 190,000 people, roughly what it had in 1920 during the first surge of the rubber boom, before most of the buildings that define the city had even been built. Goodyear is still headquartered there, and Bridgestone operates a technical center in the city. About 400 polymer-related companies work in what people now call Polymer Valley, many of them doing research rather than manufacturing. The University of Akron's College of Polymer Science and Polymer Engineering has an international reputation, and it seems fitting in a way that the city's contribution to the world shifted from making the actual tires to understanding the science of the material itself. Firestone Plant. Number 1, Harvey Firestone's original headquarters, dating to 1910, was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2014. As of 2025, it is being demolished, though portions of the clock tower and some bricks will be salvaged under an agreement with the State Preservation Office. Someone proposed adaptive reuse, turning it into housing or mixed-use development, the way other legacy cities have done with their industrial buildings. A feasibility study was funded. It never gained traction with the city. If you stand at the corner of South Main and State Streets today, where O'Neill's once anchored an entire shopping district, where the Mayflower Hotel rose across the way, where at Christmas time the animated windows drew families from 3 counties, you can still see the bones of what Akron built during those 4 extraordinary years between 1927 and 1931. The Civic Theater is still showing its starlit sky. The Art Deco tower still catches the light. Polsky's still fills its city block, though its purpose has changed. The canal bed runs beneath it all, invisible, carrying nothing. And on the east side of town, the air dock waits. 1,175 feet of curved steel, built in 7 months for $2.2 million, the largest clear-span structure anyone had ever seen, designed to house ships that would fly. The doors weigh 600 tons. They still open.